Hello, my name is Mark Vina, host of the SmartTechCheck podcast. Today's Friday, March 14th, 2025. Today, I'm joined by Francis Sideo, who is partner and principal analyst at the firm Tirias Research. And I'm thrilled to have for the first time on my podcast, Jack Gold, founder and principal analyst at J. Gold Associates. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You know, today's podcast is going to be focused on some late-breaking news that happened a couple days ago, and that is the appointment of Lip-Bu Tan. Who, my understanding is that he's now being referred to by people as LBT. It's actually very, very great shorthand. He's the new CEO of Intel. I think there's a collective sign of relief. Just that they had to name somebody, but I think he's a pretty solid candidate. We're going to go through that, of course. And of course, he's replacing Pat Gelsinger, who came back from, he was a longtime Intel executive, left Intel for a while, then came back for a few years. And then he retired back in December. So interesting stuff, lots and lots to talk about it. But Jack, since you're the newbie on my podcast, let me get your reaction.
Yeah, look, I think it's a good thing. One, he has significant experience in the semiconductor world on the software side, but Cadence, while they were building software systems, they also had to have a really good understanding of what went on in the manufacturing process, design and manufacturing those chips. So, and I'm assuming that he had a pretty good handle on that since he was CEO for 12 years or something like that.
Yes.
So I think that's a really good sign. I would have been very concerned if they had brought somebody in that was just basically a financial guy or gal. Without being sexist here. So that would have been an indication to me that they really wanted to split up the company. But bringing in somebody who actually knows the business intrinsically is real positive for me. Excuse me. It says that they probably, I hope they say it means that they probably want to keep Intel intact, both from a product and a manufacturing facility. And I think that's the right approach. I think they're worth much more. The whole is worth more than the parts in this case. And so as long as the board lets them go with it, I'm real positive on this.
Yeah, we're going to spend some serious time on that one issue because that's the $64,000 question. Is he going to split the company up or is he not? And we're going to go into that in a bit of depth. But let me get Francis Sideo's feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, so I completely agree with Jack, and I guess maybe I'll double click on it a little bit. With where Intel is at right now, they're at a crossroads in terms of their trajectory as a company, their core competencies, and what the market needs from them. And because of that, I think the next CEO, in this case LBT, needed to have a certain amount of balance in multiple disciplines and multiple backgrounds and areas. So on one side, like Jack said, he's got a good balance of semiconductor, and also software, but also part of that because of his tenure at Cadence, an understanding of the foundry and manufacturing side of things, along with design. But also, I think he strikes a good balance of being external to Intel, so to speak, but also internal in that he was part of the board. So he has some internal insights into what he could do to fix the issues. And I think both of those things are really important in this situation because he's going to need to affect some change. And those balances and the credibility that he has striking that balance, I think, is going to help him to affect the change that he needs to affect.
Yeah, and let me react to a few things you said. Is that this was a tough hire. When you think of the job description, this is not someone you just put on LinkedIn or you put on jobs.com and you're going to get a bunch of resumes. You really do require someone that has a very mixed background. He's obviously got a software background. He's got a connection with I think he understands the Chinese semi market and the Chinese technology industry, which is a big, I think, significant deal. No question, he did a significant turnaround at Cadence, which you got to give him credit for. And by the way, he also has the bonus is that he is familiar with Intel because he was on the board for several years. And that's not insignificant, in terms of having some prior experience, but yet, and Francis, we talked about this when Gelsinger retired. What my fear is that they were going to promote someone from within, or even if they didn't promote someone from within, they would bring someone from the outside who didn't have the kind of background, kind of like what happened with Lou Gerstner at IBM, where they brought him in. Now IBM wasn't a silicon company in those days, but they brought in he was essentially a customer. He was at American Express and Nabisco, and that worked out. But in this, Intel's an interesting company in that, it requires someone with a very strong technology background. So I kind of like that. So there's a lot of boxes that he checks that I think is appealing to me. I wonder, and here's the opinion I'd like to get. Let me pose this to Jack. You think there are handcuffs on him and what he can do? In other words, meaning that I think the answer is no, because I don't think he would take the job if the board was going to handcuff him. But do you think that if he goes down the path of wanting to separate the companies, and by the way, there have been some former Intel board members that have been pushing that point of view, so it's not an alien view, at least at the board level. But do you think when you look across the Intel board, do you think that they're saying, hey, you got to do what's right? And, obviously they'll provide their feedback, but Jack, do you think he's going to have his hands handcuffed? He's got to go down the path of keeping the company united?
That's an interesting question, and it's to be determined, right? There are a couple of things that I would like to add about LBT. One is that because he was at Cadence for, forever, he knows pretty much everybody in the semiconductor industry, right? From the design side to the production side. So that's a real positive in the sense of, if you want to keep Intel together and promote the Foundry, he's got the contacts. He can help do that. That also means, though, that if you want to sell them off, he's got the same contacts and can do that. So I'm hopeful that, look, I really think that Intel has turned a corner, right? I think that it's still going to take 1 to 2 years for them to show it. I think we have to be patient about that. But I really think that the Foundry is getting their act together. Pat Gelsinger put that in play. They didn't let him finish it, but I think that it's well along. So selling off the Foundry now, who would you sell it to? So let's assume that I wanted to sell it tomorrow to TSMC. Why would they buy it? What does it give them? It's still going to take a year or two of heavy investment and reformation, if you will, to get it up to snuff to where they already are. Same thing with the Ohio fab that they're building out for Intel. It'll take another 3 years to get that up and running. So for 3 years, if you're thinking of buying Intel manufacturing, you've got a pretty heavy mortgage for the most part, right? You're going to have to pay down without really getting any value out of it. So I think it's going to be a tough sell. I also think, to your original question, I think the board bringing this fellow on needs to let him do his thing, not interfere. I mean, don't bring somebody in if you're telling them what to do.
Yes.
Especially this high-powered executive. If you want to do that, you can bring in I was going to say some flunky. That's not fair. But, somebody who basically the board installs to do their whim. This guy doesn't seem like.
No, I agree with you. I don't think he's the type of guy that would accept a job under those conditions.
Yeah, I think it's less handcuffing, but I think it's more of, I'm sure there is some level of alignment, right? So there's probably some big points of view where they have to have some kind of alignment, because you got to be pulling for the same shore. Now, how you get to that shore, I think, so it's less about handcuffing LBT as more of, okay, they have some basic alignment on some of the, big swaths of where the direction they need to go. And based on, even when Sinsner and MJ took over as interim, they made a point of saying, at least in the short term, keeping the two parts of the company together. And I think that makes sense for a lot of the reasons Jack mentioned, but also just I'm a firm believer that the path that Pat put them on is actually the right path. It was just taking too long to materialize for what maybe the board or Wall Street wanted.
Right.
So I think that's going to continue to keep going. But in terms of potential other people, first of all, I don't think TSMC would pass muster in terms of regulations. You'd have a major monopoly in that situation.
There would be antitrust issues there, I think.
Yeah, but you might have some other, and I'm not saying there's any rumors about this at all, but I can see somebody like a GF, like a Global Foundries or somebody like that. But they made a strategic decision to be very tactical about what parts of the foundry they want. So it would be kind of almost a reversal for them to go back to taking Intel on. But in the interest of national interest and national security, maybe they could be convinced to do that. But it wouldn't.
They're not a U.S. company. They're not a U.S. company either.
Yeah.
Right.
But Global Foundries is here locally or in the U.S. and they are, I believe, one of the few that were designated as a trusted foundry.
Right. But so let me throw out a contrarian view, because I know, all things being equal, Intel, having control of your foundry business should be a plus, especially when in terms of the design standpoint. Remember, that was Intel's value proposition for years and years when I worked at Compaq and Dell. Hey, we both design the chips and we manufacture them, and that allows us a lot of things to increase our ability to get from a time to market standpoint. The world has changed very much since the late 90s. And the thing that LBT is going to have to deal with, and Intel, the board, is that the political environment right now is that $8 billion that they're getting vis-a-vis the CHIP Act, that money may not materialize.
Right.
And Intel cannot do this by themselves. They need that $8 billion. I mean, putting the foundry business is an incredibly capital intensive business. Yeah. And I just think that even if everything lines up, they're making the traction in the foundry area that both of you guys have cited. And I do believe that. And by the way, they've also made a lot of traction on the design side as well. I think we should give them credit. But let me finish, Francis. So the really question is that if that $8 billion goes away, and there are lots and lots of rumors that the Trump administration may do that, where do you go? Where do you go there? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, I would probably have a different viewpoint on that, Mark. And this is from conversations both, with the company and with others. The $8 billion obviously is nothing to sneeze at, but the indications that I get from my sources is that it's not a linchpin to their plans on the foundry side. It is a part of it, but keep in mind with the CHIPS Act too, it's not like they're getting that $8 billion beforehand and then be able to use that to do the investments. They have to hit certain milestones where they put in their own investments, and then they get.
There are strings attached. I get that. So, but again, it's not an insignificant factor.
It's not, but the indicators that I'm seeing from again various conversations across both the company and externally is that it's not a showstopper. If obviously they don't want it to go away, it'll help tremendously, but it's not necessarily a showstopper. It might have some other impacts of maybe increasing the amount of time it takes them to bring certain things up or whatnot, but they have a path towards where they want to go, from what it sounds like.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that, in my opinion. So let's look at what the CHIP Act was meant to do. Right, it was meant to keep manufacturing in the U.S.
Yes,
strategically. There are a few things that are happening. First of all, as you guys know, there is an initiative within Intel's fabs to make sure that strategic military government programs get manufactured here. So that's number one. Number two is 8 billion would be hard to replace. But the 8 billion plus, it's not just the 8 billion, it's the 50 whatever total that would go away, excuse me, across the industry. It's not just about Intel, it's also about what it would do to the US industry. So think of it this way. A significant portion of those dollars were meant to train the next generation of technicians and manufacturing people that would work in those fabs. That could be tens of thousands of people. Secondly, if those folks don't get trained and those jobs don't materialize, the local communities where they would live and buy stuff and send their kids to school don't get the tax revenues, don't get the shops, don't get the plazas or the supermarkets. So for every employee that they would train, they'd probably create 3 or 4 other jobs, plumbers, doctors, whatever. And finally, let's take Ohio as an example. If Intel suddenly decided they weren't going to complete the Ohio fab, those guys are not going to get those tax revenues for the next 40, 50, 60 years that they would get in that community. So it's not just about Intel. Certainly we're talking about Intel here, but it's important for people to understand that the CHIPS Act is really much wider than that. In fact, there was a significant amount of money in the CHIPS Act targeted towards making sure that the U.S. stays ahead of the pack when it comes to 5G, 6G technologies.
Yeah.
People didn't even talk about that.
That's a really great point, Jack. All of that, and to that point, whether or not this 8 billion or the funding goes away, like some of the rumors say, to me, because of the points that you make, Jack, if it does go away, it's a temporary going away. Maybe there's a resetting, because philosophically at the core of it, what was behind the CHIPS Act is still aligned with this current administration's larger goals of repatriation and making sure America is capable of sustaining its own, high-tech infrastructure. So it might change in form, but I don't think it's going to necessarily go away just because of.
I think I disagree with you on this one, Francis. The process, yes, let's say the Trump administration wants to bring chips back to the U.S. manufacturing. The process they put in place is, if we tax the hell out of everything with tariffs, they'll build plants here in the U.S. The problem with that philosophy is that once you even if you do that, let's say the tariffs go on, it's going to raise prices on chips by 25%, round number. What doesn't have a chip in it today? So everything's going to be more expensive. Number two is, even if you do that today and they decided they were going to build, it takes 3 to 4 years to build a new fab. So for 3 or 4 years, you're going to be paying those tariffs. That's number two. Number three is, for that period of time, once those tariffs are in place, they're never going away. People will get used to paying the higher amount of money, the higher costs, and it'll just be rolled in. I mean, look at the tariffs they put in for China from the first administration. So incentives work much better than penalties.
I think the only point I would disagree with you, Jack, is I don't necessarily think that it's that that directly connected in terms of the tariffs, because the tariffs are also being used not just for incentivizing, and I guess using a big stick to bring manufacturing on shore. It's also being used as a big stick for other
behavioral changes.
Behavior.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a little bit wild. If it was just that, I would agree with you, but I don't think it is that as directly or one-to-one connected as you're making it. But I mean, we could probably spend a whole multiple webcasts on just that. So I don't know, Mark, if we want to.
There is one more topic I want to hit before we sign off, but I do think Jack made a really good point in that this is a very complicated issue. It's not just kind of a, this is not like you could decide this in about 30 seconds. And the impact to the states where these foundries are is significant. There's a tax revenue impact. I got that. The issue that I personally get very, it makes my head spin, is the national security issue. I think we all agree that we don't want to see chips winding up in F-14s and F-16s and military equipment that were manufactured outside the United States. So that's a big thorny issue. But the topic I want to get with you finally before we end things here is the whole idea. And I love to talk about this, Francis, is the Intel culture, and that there's some great elements of the Intel culture. There's some not so great things of the Intel culture. And one of the things that LBT is going to have to fix, and there's been some reference to this in some of the articles that I've read this morning, is that he knows he's got to take this on. I mean, whether you want to call it a silo mentality at Intel, whether it's on the product side, which needs to be fixed. I do think, having dealt with a lot of great Intel folks, I think there's a recognition, because many people who have been there, if you've dealt with Intel, and I know both of you guys have, many of these folks have been there for 15, 20, 25 years. And when you have folks that have been there for a long time, you get into this kind of not invented here syndrome, which I think is a big challenge, frankly, that I think LBT is going to have to overcome. So on the subject of culture, Jack, let me just give you a second to react to that, because I just think it's an important topic to talk about.
Absolutely important. A couple of comments on that. Number one is, any company the size of Intel, 100,000 plus employees, are always going to have these issues. I mean, it's just inherent. Microsoft's got the issues.
Yep.
Meta has these issues.
Apple
Google has these issues.
Oh yeah,
everyone does. So that's number one. Number two is that Intel over the last, I'd say, 4, 5, 6 years, grew complacent. They thought they owned the place. They didn't see the people sneaking up behind and biting them on the butt, right? And so that's the piece that has to change. We have to get to a point where underneath, right, in the foundations, we have to bring up people. Intel has to bring up people, not we. But, well, maybe they'll put us in charge and then we can solve all those problems. But in the meantime, they have to bring up the people that really have great new ideas, that really want to take risks to get the rewards. And that's something Intel was risk averse over the last several years. And that's why they're in the position that they're in. And that's why AMD is in the position it's in. And NVIDIA is in the position it's in. They weren't risk averse. So I absolutely agree with you, Mark. The culture is going to have to change. The question is, in a ship that size, how quickly can you do it?
Right. No, I agree with that. And I think you cited it beautifully. I mean, when you think of the markets, the categories that Intel has missed, smartphones, back in the day, MP3 players. I mean, that seemed like 100 years ago, but they did miss that because they didn't have a solution for the MP3 market. Tablets. So, I mean, the list goes on. And I think there, again, that to me, that was a cultural thing. It wasn't a technology thing. But anyway, Francis, let me get your reaction to the culture issue.
First of all, completely agree with you and Jack on what you guys have said. I mean, the good thing about LBT is he kind of did that at Cadence, right? I mean, there was a culture issue, and also the good and I mentioned this earlier, is him being an external. I mean, one of the things that Intel has always been kind of like a negative feedback to Intel has always been, hey, there's too much internal. The executive level is filled with people that have been there for 20, 30 years. They kind of started doing that with Justin Hotard, who has since left Intel, but, bringing in, and at the highest level, at the CEO level, they brought in somebody that's external. The good thing about that, and again, that bridge, is that he's also a quote unquote internal Intel board member. So he has that kind of merging of the two things that's going to let him affect these changes that he's going to need to make, because the Intel staunch NIH people aren't going to be able to say, oh, well, he's not from Intel, but well, he does have the Intel pedigree, but he has an external outlook on things. And this is what he did at Cadence. He's very customer centric. So I think if he brings some of that back into Intel, and Jay's very customer centric, and from my conversations with Intel Foundry leadership, they're very adaptable to all the different changes and business models they have to engage in, and not saying, hey, thou shalt engage with Intel in this way. So I think there's a lot of good signs from a culture standpoint that change is going to happen.
So in the few minutes we have left here, because we're going to revisit this topic again, it'll be interesting to see LPT get his footing, and I'm sure we'll see some interesting stuff. I think the one thing I would say, I don't think he has 2 or 3 years to get his hands around things. I think he's got about 12 months, honestly. Maybe
it might not be long enough.
And it could be, that could be problematic. But as we kind of wrap this up, Jack, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, one of the things I would like to see is him go in on day one and just light a fire under everybody there, right? Perform or get out. I'm being harsh, but that's really what it's going to take. And because he's an industry insider, he's seen what's going on at AMD. He's seen what's going on at NVIDIA. I mean, he was a supplier to those guys. He's seen what's going on at China and all the other companies out there. He should know the best processes of what's going on. If he can actually bring that in, and Francis, as you said, and Mark, you said as well, this is not, this wasn't inbred, right? He wasn't inbred into the company.
Yes.
It was bringing in a new cultural leader. And if he can do that, and it's been done before. I mean, look at Microsoft when Satya came in, right? It was the same kind of thing. There have been a few of those kinds of situations.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I agree with that completely. Francis.
That's what he needs to do.
Francis.
Yeah. The other example to that, Jack, is IBM. Look at what Arvin's been able to do.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. So, I think just a last thought on this is he seems to be the right person. I think there's already been kind of an invigoration. And if there's a good maybe silver lining to the kind of relatively tough situation Intel's in, I think if anything, it's a wake up call for the internal Intel folks saying, look, we're not the 90% gross margin, leader that we were in the PC days, in the Wintel days, right? And we're kind of in an existential survival mode here, and that tends to help motivate people past their past behavior. So hopefully with those those combination of factors with LBT then capping that off, it's a good position for Intel to hopefully turn around.
That's great. Well, Jack, Francis, this was a great discussion. We'll certainly revisit this topic in the not too distant future. To my audience, thanks for taking the time to join me for today's podcast. For a viewing and listening audience, thanks for making the SmartTechCheck podcast part of your day or commute. Please make sure that you hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of today's podcast, or use these convenient on-screen QR codes to connect with me. You can also follow me on X at Mark Vina Tech Guy. Jack and Francis, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jack.